Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. At the outset, St. Vincent and the Grenadines expresses its deepest and most profound sympathy and solidarity to the government and people of the Philippines who are struggling with the tragic impact of Typhoon Doha. St. Vincent and the Grenadines aligns itself with the statement made by the Alliance of Small Island States and with the statements made by all other AOSIS members, in particular those of the Caribbean community. Given our logistical constraints, St. Vincent and the Grenadines will largely limit this intervention to the subject of climate financing. Mr. President, in conferences past, the contours of a grand bargain were defined between the most vulnerable states and those most responsible for our predicament. The developed and wealthy countries placed their most valuable commodity on the table, money, in exchange for the developing world's most precious commodity, our dwindling time to survive. At its most basic, the Copenhagen Accord and subsequent COP outcomes formally enshrined an agreement of buying time. We who wanted immediate action gave the developed countries time until 2020 to be legally obliged to reform their economic base and slash their emissions. In return, the developed world pledged money to help us mitigate, offset, and adapt to the effects of their deferred action. In addition to being an indication of seriousness and good faith, the pledged funding represented a monetary down payment on future policy action. But the deal of dollars for degrees, of buying time, has unraveled, and distressingly so, at this conference. Now we are told that in this period of crisis, the previously promised dollars are too difficult to come by. We now hear about financing gaps, empty shell funds, and ever more creative means of accounting. Let's not worry about finance and numbers at this conference, they say. Let's revisit the deal. But we cannot. Our time has already been spent. 332 consecutive months of above-average temperature have elapsed. The oceans have warmed and risen. The storms and hurricanes have intensified. The floods have worsened. The droughts have lengthened. We cannot turn back the clock, and we have no more time left to give. Yes, the entire world is facing an economic crisis. But small island developing states are facing an existential crisis. Our existential crisis is neither cyclical nor temporary. It cannot be solved by austerity, stimulus, or elections. And it is immune to delay, empty promises, or excuses. Mr. President, even in the midst of this ongoing global and economic crisis, let us not accept the blatant falsehood that developed countries cannot afford to continue scaling up from today's $30 billion in fast start financing to the promised $100 billion in green climate funding. Let us not forget that the collective GDP of the Annex I countries is in the neighborhood of $45 trillion. In that context, $100 billion is a rounding error. Let us not forget that in the midst of the crisis, Wall Street financiers paid themselves $20 billion in year-end bonuses, and that London bankers helped themselves to $7 billion more. That's bonuses, not salary. Let us recall the $16 billion cost of the London Olympic Games and the $6 billion spent on the just concluded elections in the United States. That is not to criticize a single dollar of that expenditure, which individuals, countries, and corporations can spend as they see fit. Rather, the point is that climate finance is not a priority in the public or private sectors of our developed partners, and that the attempts to renege on the pledge to scale up from $30 billion to $100 billion are based not on adversity, but apathy. The financing pledged in 2009 is already less than adequate, and everybody knows it. The conversation should be on the adequacy of those past pledges, not whether they will materialize at all. As a point of reference, Hurricane Sandy cost $80 billion in damage in 3 states in the United States. If one storm can cause $80 billion in damage in one country, to say nothing of the damage to Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, and the Bahamas, what is $100 billion for all the vulnerable countries of the world? The governor of New York recently petitioned the United States Congress for $9 billion in adaptation financing for his state. That single request dwarfs the Fast Start adaptation financing provided to the entire developing world over the past 3 years. Mr. President, our failure on climate finance is not due to an absence of money, but a bankruptcy of political will. Nearsighted politicians around the globe see no immediate political penalty for foot-dragging on climate change. They see no value in contributing to a grand global struggle in securing this generation's role in the stewardship of our planet. So they place austerity above posterity. As long as climate change remains a low priority item to be sporadically addressed with surplus discretionary funding in times of plenty, then the promised financing will never materialize. Minister after minister has taken to this podium in recent days to label the Green Climate Fund as an empty shell. It also represents a cynically empty promise, a comfort to a set of countries who have bet their lives on hollow pledges of future action. But the lack of action belies the words that we fight so hard to negotiate, and the credibility gap between words and deeds is widening. After the empty cynicism of this conference, can we dare to believe the promise of $100 billion? Can we dare to believe that we will limit our temperature rise to below 2 degrees? Can we dare to hope for an equitable and legally binding treaty by 2015 when there is so little movement in 2012? Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines wants to be clear. The pledged financing of $100 billion per year is an immutable minimum. Further, the 2015 and 2020 dates agreed to in Durban are immovable deadlines. We will not revisit them. It is no longer feasible to bring them forward, and they are scientifically, environmentally, and morally impossible to push backwards. Our failure in climate finance is linked to the underlying failure of ambition in this conference. It is at the root of our failure on adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. We must also agree to concrete, measurable, and predictable sources of new, additional, and scaled-up finance at this COP, or we too will have failed. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines would like to conclude by thanking the State of Qatar for its exemplary hospitality and deft diplomacy in the hosting and stewardship of this conference. As host and as President, the State of Qatar has exceeded every expectation and has done all that is humanly and politically imaginable to create the optimum conditions for comfortable, productive, and well-structured negotiations. Unfortunately, to date, we, the parties to this negotiation, have not risen to the occasion in the same manner as our gracious hosts. But a few hours remain. Let us not waste them. Time is running out. Shukran.
I would like to thank His Excellency for his statement.